Hi, I did my article over social stories, the social stories intervention package for students with autism in inclusion classroom settings. And I chose this article because I really am interested in the social, emotional well-being and interactions with other kids in the general ed setting, because that's what I do. I'm an inclusion, I'm the gen ed teacher in an inclusion class. So, this article stated that at the time that this article was written, there wasn't a lot of research with social stories in general education inclusion classes. So this was in a kindergarten classroom in a public school. It was with two little boys, Matt, who was 6, and Ted, who was 5. And they both had teaching assistants, which is helpful, to train these kids how to use their social stories and to implement the interventions and stuff to have that assistant. They were observed during circle time where they were, their behaviors were identified, the target behaviors that they wanted to pick. These were the same for both boys: inappropriate social interactions, appropriate hand raising, and inappropriate vocalizations. And they did a really good job at defining what specifically the inappropriate vocalizations are in the article. Also at what inappropriate social interactions looked like. They were getting very close to their peers, specifically Matt was centimeters away from them. And the inappropriate vocalizations were just things that were irrelevant to classroom activities or interrupting classroom activities, distracting. So that's when they started to actually collect the baseline data, is after those target behaviors were identified. This was a multiple probe design across behaviors. They collected those baseline data points during hour-long observation sessions and established classroom rules and discipline procedures that were remaining in effect throughout this time. They introduced the social stories, the assistants did, and they practiced this intervention over 18 sessions. Each session lasted between 10 and 20 minutes, and it was a 3-step process. So the child would get the choice: do you want me to read your social story out loud to you, or do you want to read it to yourself? And they got to choose. Then after that, the assistant would ask the child some comprehension questions about the social story to make sure that they could understand what they were reading or getting read to, and then they would role play. And that's when, the teacher assistant would either play the teacher or the peer, and the child would have to prove that they understood what that replacement behavior or other behavior was that they were going to be doing. There's some really good graphs here that shows baseline, intervention, and then follow-up data. Across the board with both children, they showed improvement on all 3 target behaviors, and they did follow-ups on both children, and it seems like in both cases these were lasting effects from the intervention. They talk about inter-observer agreement and treatment integrity and social validity. Sorry, that word is hard for me in here, and it really supports that, what they were doing. There was agreement and integrity and validity. So for Matt, there was more of an immediate decrease than for Ted maybe, but there were decreases in those problem behaviors and increases in those behaviors that they wanted, which was the hand raising. One thing that I found interesting while I was reading this was to think that these were kindergarteners, 5 and 6-year-olds, and they were given the choice to read independently, like read this to yourself, and they were able to answer comprehension questions afterwards. Granted, these weren't difficult texts or complex texts by any means, but still, just to be able to sit and read anything independently at 5 years old seems like they have fantastic comprehension, decoding, verbal skills, And it did say in the results and discussion portion of this article, students without such verbal abilities may not benefit as readily from social stories or might require additional intervention components to achieve effects via different behavioral mechanisms. It also says that it is possible that modeling and role play could have achieved the same effects without the stories. And it just makes me think, I have a student who uses social stories, and modeling is such an important aspect of it, and it's such a powerful thing for these children to see, any child to see, but especially children who are struggling socially, just to see what appropriate looks like and feels like. So that did make me wonder, what skills does a child have to already possess in order to benefit from social stories? It was a really good article. Obviously, I'm going to link it in this post. But again, it was called A Social Stories Intervention Package for Students with Autism in Inclusion Classroom Settings. Thanks.